Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to another teacher's workshop. And this week we are moving forward in the Luke narrative to chapter 5. I realized in studying for this, I actually did not have this lesson prepared from our Sunday school quarterly intensive that we did back in February. So had to rely less on notes that were not prepared and then come directly from the chapter. So we'll read a couple of verses from this. But this account in and of itself, with respect to, as you see, the subtitle on the screen, The First Disciples, is familiar to us from the synopsis of Matthew first, being positioned before Mark in the canon. So if we're reading canonically, then we'll get a more full account of the calling of those first disciples. From Matthew's perspective, then we will Mark not really adding much to the account that Matthew has not already mentioned before. And so by the time we get to Luke, it becomes one of those exercises in repetitiveness and to some maybe even futility. And of course with that, when we're teaching just these 11 verses from the corpus of Luke, and we're going to talk about the concept of Jesus calling the first disciples in a vacuum of sorts, without really talking about how this connects to the previous 4 chapters of Luke, and why he situates this material where he does, and the extra detail he adds in this account, which we'll touch on here, then we'll leave it at that, basically, that we're just given one more encounter of Jesus calling these first disciples, which happens to be 2 pair of fishermen, 2 sets of brothers. Andrew first, of course, we understand from John's gospel, Andrew was a disciple of John, but John's the first one to give us that information, not included in any of the other preceding gospels, who then has already told Peter something about finding this candidate who very well could be the Messiah. And then, of course, the fateful encounter where Jesus is coming to them on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, has this moment where he wants to teach the massive crowd that's followed. And then, of course, Simon, hearing these words of Jesus, it will accept the call, which comes right after this miraculous moment with putting the nets down, catching the fish, that signifies to Peter, indeed, what Andrew has told him is true, and that Jesus is the Messiah. That Peter will, of course, leave everything behind, as will Andrew, follow him, and then the call to the sons of Zebedee to do the same. So, of course, it's there for the sake of posterity understanding that these were the first of the disciples, and of course, from these, we understand that 3 of them, the 2 sons of Zebedee and Peter, will become part of the inner circle of Jesus, who will be privy to additional teaching and training and so forth. And of course, all of them will have pivotal positions to play in the church once Jesus is gone from the scene and we move on into the Acts of the Apostles, or the Acts of the Holy Spirit, in the book of Acts itself. So all that being said, I pretty much covered what a standardized Sunday school lesson regarding any one of these passages in Matthew, Mark, or Luke might include. And of course, with that, an applicable point or two with respect to the idea of this is a call that transcends the first disciples turned apostles to all who would follow Jesus as disciples, and a command that we all must observe with complete, non-negotiable obedience. And that is, we are told that we should be fishers of men, and we are to carry this message, not so much as eyewitnesses, because we ourselves did not encounter Jesus the way that these men did, but with the legacy and what we understand to be the faithful witness, the truthful witness of the acts of Jesus, the life of Jesus, and what has been passed down to us in the form of these words and so forth, on to those people who have yet to come into the faith, who have yet to become part of God's covenant family. And that would not be a bad way of telling this. However, I would say as teachers, if we have adult students, or at least students who as youth, who have been part of church for quite some time, grown up in this environment and culture, and have been exposed to these stories from the Gospels that many of us are probably familiar with, I would say we could probably venture out a little bit more into the, no pun intended, deep, coming from what Jesus is saying to Peter here, venture out into the deep a little bit and talk a little bit more at a higher level with respect to why Luke, if he's writing a separate gospel encounter, that presumably he understands Mark and Matthew have already written and they've included this information, then why does he go after the same particular story and pretty much the same way, with exception to one detail. And not to say there aren't small, subtle nuances, but one glaringly obvious detail that he gives here, which I will capitalize on here in just a minute. So let's just take a brief minute to summarize essentially what Luke has been telling us over the course of this entire gospel. So I'm not going to take a lot of time to do that. I've been kind of doing that somewhat systematically over the course of these last couple of weeks as we've been inside the Gospel of Luke for almost a month now. But what we should understand, with respect to the way that Luke is piecing his gospel together, is that he has, among many themes, a centralized agenda that he is attaching every story to. And like his contemporaries, Matthew and Mark, and of course John will do the same, they are modularizing the aspects of Jesus' life with respect to these major stories, these blocks of teaching, miracles, and so forth. And they are moving some of these things around. They are choosing to insert specific details that feed into what that centralized agenda is. So Matthew and Luke probably share more information in common with each other than Mark. That does not mean that we should just sideline Mark and then treat it with a special position of honor as pretty much the first canonized, well, let me retract that, the first gospel that was perhaps written before any of the others were. And after we relegate it to that position of primacy, which there are arguments that may suggest it wasn't, that Luke or Mark has served its purpose. But now we can move on to more aggrandized accounts in Matthew and Luke because there's more information there. There's a lot more to Mark than meets the eye, but this is not the conversation that we're having today. But I am paralleling it against Matthew, not so much because it shares more information than Mark does, but because Matthew and Luke seem to be marching to the same drum, and that is they start out with birth narratives. And when they start out with birth narratives, of course, Luke is going to give us the birth narrative of John the Baptist, and he's doing so for a particular reason and showing us his position as the forerunner of Jesus. But more than just being the one who, as a prophet to Israel, is recognized as such, as is the case from Matthew's perspective. Matthew, to his predominantly Jewish audience, doesn't have to spend so much time explaining the significance behind this particular person's birth other than to quote from Isaiah, as goes the answer of John's identity, because those people would recognize the centuries they have went without a prophet. This man shows up on the scene. He was recognized by many to be a prophet. And of course, Matthew is writing decades after John's decapitation. So he was widely recognized to be a prophet, and he didn't have to give much credence as to why exactly that's the case. Luke, on the other hand, is trying to help us understand from the perhaps one of the more primary themes that weave this gospel together is that Jesus is more than just Messiah to Israel. He is Messiah to all races of mankind. And with that, we also will see that infiltrate the aspects of Luke's birth narrative over Matthew's birth narrative. Matthew wants to make sure that we understand that Jesus is the promised seed to Abraham and the descendant come from David who has the right to bear his royal crown. And with that, a lot of the other details with respect to the visitation of the Magi or those wise men are coming to pay homage to this promised king with their very expensive gifts and so forth that would be befitting for a king. Luke, on the other hand, is wanting to make sure that we understand something of the position of many of the people that come to Jesus or interact with Jesus in his gospel before we even get to Jesus being born, much less talking. And we start that with Mary's particular song that she speaks to in a very Hannah, mother of Samuel type of way, talking about how God is going to be flipping the paradigm across the spectrum for everything, and the kingdom that this particular Messiah and King is going to rule over is in every way going to be different from the kingdom that anybody would have been expecting, much less a kingdom from an earthly or terrestrial perspective. And so as we move forth through that, we even get things like Zechariah's prophecy and talking about much of the same thing and how God is visiting his people, but this visitation is going to be a particular treat or blessing, echoing the words of Simeon that's going to be coming soon about how Jesus is going to be a light and God's prepared salvation, not just for his own people, but the Gentiles as well. So moving forward through that, we get into the birth narrative of Jesus, and the particular people that are invited to come and see are not stately men from the east, such as these Magi, but instead it's the lowly shepherds of Bethlehem. Jesus is called out of Egypt in Matthew's gospel to rebrand Israel through this particular kingly descendant through David. And Luke is going to take the same thing and do much of the same that Matthew has done, but he's going to do it from a different perspective. He is going to be rebranding Israel through Messiah, but not so much as its king, but more so as the promised servant that is supposed to come to fulfill the oracles of Isaiah. So then we move more through chapter 2 until eventually we get into chapter 3, where John the Baptist shows up. In Matthew chapter 3, Luke chapter 3, almost the exact same narratives with respect to John the Baptist out there baptizing in the Jordan, and then with that, Jesus comes to be baptized. We have some exchange of information through their dialogue and slightly different details, but what we clearly understand is the same outcome. After Jesus is baptized, the heavens are opened, the dove comes down, well, the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove, and we hear the words being spoken by the Lord to make sure we all clearly understand that not only is this the promised seed, His beloved one, mimicking the very things that were said about Isaac to Abraham from the Lord when the Lord was calling Abraham to sacrifice this precious son of his, but also the words of Psalm 2 with respect to that Davidic descendant who is recognized to be the legitimate heir and God's adopted son ruling at his right hand. But then the very same words that come from the Isaiah text of 42, 49 and beyond, of this being His servant or chosen one in whom He delights. Combining these two pictures together, and again, this gives credence to the combining of Matthew and Luke's symmetry with respect to Matthew's emphasis on him being the Davidic descendant and Luke's emphasis on him being this servant from the Isaiah oracles. So as we move through the account, after Jesus is baptized, of course he winds up being sent into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. There we just saw Luke's genealogical account, and the temptations are given the same, slightly different ordering between Matthew and Luke. There's some significance to that, but we're not going to touch on that. Just point being, emphasizing here that there are nuances that Luke places on the text that Matthew does not. And that, of course, causes us to give great pause here to this particular moment where Matthew, after Jesus comes out of the wilderness, just winks in a couple of verses at Jesus going back to Galilee and beginning His ministry there by telling us that Jesus, while in Galilee, calls the first of His disciples. That's how he ends chapter 4, with Jesus then preparing for what's going to become the Sermon on the Mount, His kingdom manifesto. He's announced the kingdom has come, the time is at hand. People are to repent and believe this good news of the kingdom, which is pretty much where Mark starts his gospel in chapter 1. Luke, on the other hand, wants to slow this narrative down and make sure that he's breathing some air into it for the sake of us seeing what's actually happening when Jesus goes to Galilee. So one of these stops happens to be at his hometown synagogue, and he preaches this sermon from the Isaiah text, in which he, rolling to chapter 61 of that scroll, makes it clear to everyone his announcement is not so much of a kingdom. Now, I will say this, Luke is not working against Matthew, presuming that the ordering of the Gospels in their writing would be Mark, then Matthew. If Luke was privy to Matthew, either as an eyewitness and a source that he used even before Matthew published his Gospel, that he would have access to the same information and material, and knowing perhaps where Matthew was going to be coming from, chose to emphasize what he is going to hear, recognizing that as others are going to be exposed and introduced to the story of Jesus, especially from Matthew's perspective and Mark's, that it was quite clear Jesus was announcing the arrival of the kingdom. He doesn't have to come at it from that perspective. So to couple that message with something different, the only logical thing from the announcement of God the Father over His baptized Son, talking about Him being His Son, the Davidic descendant, but also His servant whom He delights in, is to come at it with this very unique story that Luke comes into contact with, and that is this fateful Sabbath when Jesus is in his hometown synagogue and he happens to preach from Isaiah, and he is stating that this very concept of this messianic figure fulfilling the Jubilee that is going to be eternal in its duration and span, and of course its scope and depth, has happened. And of course the controversy that surrounded it when his own people that he grew up amongst decided to react so negatively. And so Luke wants to include that here for us and then build upon that story. Now, again, Matthew 4 ends with Jesus announcing the kingdom and then calling out the first of his disciples as a renewed Israel that he himself is going to begin as the servant, noted in Isaiah to be Israel, personified as one person. It all starts with him. It all truncates from him and then branches as a new tree, if you will, starting with these disciples. And that, of course, is why it's not coincidental that he chooses 12, not 9, 10, or 11, or even beyond 12, but 12 because of the significance that number holds. Before Luke gets to that moment where Jesus begins to call those disciples, he has Jesus in his hometown synagogue announcing Jubilee has come. And what's the significant message behind Jubilee? It's release. Release of everything. It begins first with a spiritual release, because if we go back to the Leviticus text of Leviticus 25, we recognize that the Day of Atonement, ending the 49th year and beginning the 50th year, which is the time that Jubilee begins, starts with the land being purged, starting with the holy places inside the tabernacle or temple of all the sin and iniquity that's defiled it from the people. It's a spiritual reset, a spiritual release that inaugurates what comes next. And over the course of the next year, the people are going to begin first by setting everything back to the way it was when the people came into the land and started taking their tribal allotments that Joshua and Moses had prescribed for them. All debts are forgiven, slaves are released, and they're sent away with clothes and food, jewelry. It's as if they themselves are coming right out of Egypt and going into Canaan as exiles from Egypt and going to the Promised Land for the first time. And then, of course, tribal allotments and boundaries are reconfigured to go back to the earliest setting when they come back to the land. And so all of this reset, release motif gives rise to the spiritual concept of what Isaiah 61 is talking about, because this Jubilee, inaugurated by Messiah, is not to reset Israel as goes her physical property. It is a spiritual reset for all mankind, everyone who's going to become part of this new Israel, this new humanity that God is making through his servant, the Messiah, okay? Then, back to Matthew. After Matthew sees Jesus announcing the kingdom, he goes to talk about what life in the kingdom is going to be like. That's the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7. Luke follows this sermon of the announcement of the arrival of the Jubilee and its fulfillment up with how that happens. So that was last week's lessons, right? Where we saw Jesus casting demons out of people, first in the synagogue of Capernaum, then those people around Simon Peter's house after he's healed his mother, and people with various diseases coming and also being released from those maladies as Jesus is setting them free. It's the physical signs that people are seeing that can clearly give testimony to the fact he is Messiah, coming right from Isaiah 35, and the answer that Jesus is going to give to John's remaining disciples when he's asked, "Are you the one, or do we look for someone else?" He performs these specific signs of giving people back their sight, their hearing, their sense of speech, and whatnot, and of course releasing them from demonic captivity, which nobody had on their radar Messiah was going to do, all for the sake of showing not only someone as important as John, but everyone. It's unequivocal. Jesus is in every way Messiah. So we're continuing on with that concept of how he is manifesting his Jubilee. So we need to make sure as teachers we understand the Luke text up through chapter 4 and its end before we jump into chapter 5. Luke is not in this weird, disjointed way just driving us off in another direction away from these stories as if to say, I've concluded what I want to say there. Let's talk about something totally unrelated. Or, yeah, I guess I kind of got to get to him calling his first disciples at some point, so now would be a good place to put that in. He's rolling right into this story. And he's not changing much of the details, just adding in some additional information, but he wants us to see it from that perspective, that Jesus, as the servant of Isaiah, has announced the arrival of Jubilee and is manifesting what this release looks like through the events of chapter 4 and now chapter 5, which would completely explain why he puts this additional detail in here. I'm not even going to read the first 5 verses because it's almost verbatim of what Matthew would say, but instead, let me just start with verse 6. So when they put out into the deep water, they caught a great number of fish. Their nets began to tear. They signaled to their partners in the other boats to come and help them. They came. They filled both boats so full they began to sink. Matthew does not record what happens next, nor does Mark. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, because I'm a sinful man, Lord." So I'm sure many of us have asked naturally at some point when reading through this unique account given by Luke, why does he include that information? What is the point? How does it serve Luke's agenda in all of this? Does he want us to see that there's some measure of piety with Simon that the other gospel writers haven't emphasized? Does he want us to instead understand that maybe he's got a particular agenda against Peter? Because maybe in being exposed to Peter, there's that understanding. He's a bit brash. There's some braggadociousness to him. Or then again, Peter, of course, as we see in some of the polemics that others would try to insert into the gospel stories and on through the Acts narrative and the writings of the apostles, and from early church fathers and contemporaries of their time that come immediately after the age of the apostles, that supposedly there's some conflict between Peter and Paul. And of course, Luke is an advocate and a dear friend of Paul. And so perhaps as an advocate of Paul and a friend of his, there's a bias going on here, and he wants to relegate Peter to a position of either stupidity or sinfulness, or just trying to in some way devalue Peter in the eyes of others. That may sound silly and absurd, but these are the kind of, let's say, scholarly conversations that have happened over the years with respect to trying to understand the way these gospel accounts are formulated, and again, why these nuances are there or not. But if we understand what's going on here, the idea of Jesus announcing the Jubilee and this release, I think it plays right into what's going on here, because Simon recognizes he's a sinful man and that he needs to be released from his sin, and that he does not belong in Jesus' presence, and that he is not worthy of being able to not only stand in his presence, but to experience this miracle and what is about to happen next, even though I would imagine Peter has no sense of this calling that's about to be bestowed upon him. He just recognizes, almost in an Isaiah type of way, that he is in the presence of holiness and he does not belong there, and it scares him. But Jesus' remarks to him, which is not so much as him saying his sins are forgiven or that he is released, but he moves beyond to just simply tell him, for he and all these were amazed at the catch of fish they had taken, and so were James and John, Zebedee's sons, who were Simon's partners. He said, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be catching people." So he recognizes the trepidation that Peter has, but he's not simply ignoring it. He's telling him that he has a task and a mission for him, which of course, in between those words and what we're going to have to read into that space is the understanding that Jesus is seeing and sensing Peter's unworthiness. He fully recognizes that as God incarnated in human flesh. And he would, if he was going to speak it out loud, agree that yes, in every way, Peter is unworthy, as much as any man who's ever been called by God to partner with him in a specific mission. But as God has purified and made others fit for the task, so Jesus is going to be doing the same for Peter, which would be predicated upon the idea, again, much in an Isaiah type of way, as Isaiah was recognizing he was a man of unclean lips, living among the people of unclean lips and hearts, that he wasn't fit for the duty. But what does the seraph do? But come to the altar, grab a coal, touch it to his lips, tell him his sins are atoned for, and that now he is ready for the task that God has for him. So the point is that Isaiah had to be released. He had to be released from the spiritual captivity he recognized himself to be in, to then be made fit for the task, which of course this goes on through the stories of the disciples and becomes a tangible thing for every disciple over the centuries who have come to follow Christ. We all recognize in that salvific moment of repentance, we are unfit to be in his presence, to receive this wonderful gift, much less to be brought into his kingdom, to then be tasked and commissioned with becoming disciples of his and witnesses to the world of his wonders, his miracles, and the entire gospel story in and of itself. But it's that release from our own bondage and captivity that now enables us, by the impartition of his Spirit within, to do this very thing that the disciples do. So all that to say, I think what's going on here is a continuance of that theme. And of course, I would build on to this because after we get done with this, we're going to start skipping around in Luke. Next week is going to be our last Sunday in this unit and this quarter, which means we've got 3 different texts to look at. I don't think any of them are actually Gospels. I could be wrong. But when we pick back up come next quarter, we're still going to be going through Matthew and Luke, but not quite so succinctly as we are right now, following one story after the next. We're going to start skipping around in different places. And so I wouldn't say we need to try to give a full overview of Luke now. We're going to get a lot of it. But I would say there's some extra material here that if you're going to continue on with this theme of Jesus manifesting his Jubilee as Messiah, then that's what we see in the very next story panel with him cleansing a leper. Because as we enumerate what's happened so far, it's the setting free of the captive from demonic influence. As I told my Sunday school class last week, it's kind of strange how Luke, as a physician, no doubt, which this is his realm, he's a subject matter expert in the things that ail the body. And one would think if he's going to write that he would kind of nerd out on that stuff a little bit to say, hey, it was noted that Jesus did this or Jesus did that. And wow, like John does in John chapter 9, healed a man born blind. Nobody has ever heard of such a thing before. Who knows what feats Jesus did in Capernaum when he was casting out demons? But instead, Luke just sums it up by saying people who were suffering from various diseases, perhaps of all kinds. But he draws particular attention in the synagogue story of Capernaum and around Simon Peter's house to make note that there were demons being cast out. There is no greater captivity than spiritual captivity. Even if a person's sitting behind bars, they can be amongst the freest of human beings in Christ. And there are scads of anecdotal stories of people who found themselves rightfully or wrongfully imprisoned, and yet as servants of Jesus are walking faithfully with him and seeing people released from their own spiritual captivity while still behind bars or even consigned to death row. But no greater release than that. Right? And again, that feeds into what's going on here with respect to the inauguration of the eternal Jubilee and the setting free of the captives, not just from Babylon hundreds of years before with this new Exodus, but the final Exodus that is the first domino of that sees all mankind joining in with a renewed Israel following Messiah up to the summit of Mount Zion, God's cosmic mountain, or even beyond that, the Son of Man healing and forgiving. And of course, there is this story where we find from both the Matthew and Mark text of the guy who's paralyzed and being let down through the roof to be healed. I would say, without going into too much detail beyond that, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's a perfect follow-on to what Luke is trying to accomplish for us, because he is noting that Jesus here is first addressing the fact this man is locked away under spiritual captivity and spiritual separation from God through his sin, as much as he is unable to use his legs to be able to carry him around. And so he speaks to the fact this man's sins needs to be forgiven as much as his body needs to be healed, if not more so, which of course happens to the astonishment of all those in the room at hearing these things. And people, of course, are going to do one of two things: give praise to God, maybe I should say one of three. Give praise to God, walk away somewhat confused but excited of what they saw, recognizing that it is scandalous but at the same time miraculous, or outright seeing only the scandalous side of it and neglecting to even give a moment's worth of praise to God for what he had just done in allowing this man, Jesus, to heal a person who was suffering from this malady. And then, of course, the calling of Levi. I really said Levi there. Calling of Levi. I did it again. Man, Levi. Matthew. A tax collector who is in a position of isolation from his own people, his own family, because of his employment as a tax collector. And with that, it is understood to be an egregious sin on the part of his own people because of the way he is padding his own pockets. It's not so much the fact that taxes are being collected, because even Israel was collecting taxes from amongst her people as outlined in the law of Moses. So the idea that they are subjugated to Gentile powers and they have to have taxes collected is not so much the big deal, even though these people are employed by and somewhat sympathizing with Rome, but they are gaining and lining their pockets and thereby increasing their own physical and personal wealth by virtue of this at the expense of their own people, which makes it so terrible. So Levi, being in this position of spiritual isolation from both God, worst off God, and his own people, is now being released, and expressed so by the fact that Jesus is calling him. And of course, this story in all the Gospels crescendos, not so much at the moment where Matthew is called, but the fact that Jesus shows the epitomization of that acceptance of him by the fact he will go to his house. he will sit down with other tax collector friends of Matthew, and he will have a meal with them, because that is where the true boundary of where Israel versus non-Israel, the unclean Gentile world, was drawn. Because Jews will clearly eat with other Jews who they understood to be pious people who follow God and accept the laws of Moses as being good and the right way of following God, and they will shun people from their own table despite the blood connection they share with them if they did not see them as rightly practicing the laws of Moses. And of course, the case of Matthew being a tax collector, who cares what tribe the guy's from? What he's doing is enough to cause him to no longer be considered a member of Israel, and nobody will rightly sit at the table with this sort of guy, no more than they would prostitutes who, again, are from the stock and lineage of Israel. And, of course, they would treat Gentiles the same way. For Jesus as Messiah, on the other hand, to be inviting someone like Matthew to his table and sharing a meal with him is to show that he's accepted. And if Messiah is indeed Jesus, that means the kingdom has indeed come, which means Matthew is going to be given entrance and acceptance on the merit of this king rather than just the simple fact that he is a Pharisee and a good, rightly law-abiding and law-practicing citizen of the nation of Israel. So, a lot there with respect to this particular story, and it stops at the beginning of Luke 6 with respect to the Jubilee theme. So, hopefully that's helpful, insightful in some ways. Any questions? Well, if not, as always, thanks for listening.